Frank was strapped into his seat. He was one of the lucky ones. The trip was a way out, a way off of this planet, out of the country that had abandoned him. Everything from the past was going to be forgotten, which was good for him. He would either spend 10 years in a cell or 5 years on the moon. The moon was a sure bet. There wasn't going to be any worrying about dropping the soap or getting shanked in his sleep. Not only that, but his family was getting paid well. What could be better? He'd always wanted to go into space. Now he'd gotten a free trip, all expenses paid from the government. 20 years ago, it was just a pipe dream. Now it was the lesser of two evils. Even though these trips had been happening for the past 6 months without problems, he was nervous. He remembered all the disasters that had happened in the early years. He was a teen in 1999, so the really early problems were before him. He was still too young to remember the Challenger, but he watched the videos. Then there was the Columbia disaster, which he did remember. Sweat was starting to form on Frank's brow. He looked over to the officers that were in the shuttle with him. One was smiling, a small comfort, but welcome nonetheless. The other was stony as always. "Don't worry, Frank," Officer Steele said. "There's nothing to worry about. It's just a quick trip, and then you're free to do your services for the good of mankind." And the engine started to rumble, and Frank's breath became rapid. The pilot was seasoned. He'd flown 20 shuttles to the moon by now and had never had any problems. Frank wouldn't be the first convicted person on the moon. That was how the government was doing it. They would give the option to go to prison or to go to the moon to work on building civilization for future use. Granted, it was dangerous, but no more dangerous than being in prison. In fact, the likelihood of being fatally harmed was much slimmer on the moon. There was never anyone who was convicted of murder that was allowed to go, which brought down the death toll to nil, at least in terms of people murdering each other. There will always be accidents. That's just the way of life. It doesn't matter what rock a person was on, they couldn't avoid it.
10, 9, 8, 7.
The countdown started. Frank closed his eyes and the memories started to project on the back of his eyelids. It was not his proudest moment. There were just no other options that he could think of, and his family was starving. It was a bad time for his country. It still is. There's still more unemployment than there was since the Great Recession. Frank never thought that they had truly gotten out of that era. The government would say that they had, but it seemed like inflated numbers and lies. It was different from the days he remembered as a child. Maybe that was because he was so young, but there were some major differences that he couldn't have overlooked as a young boy. The biggest of all was that the U.S. didn't have a president anymore. The leader was elected for life, and for the past 5 years, the same man was in office, and he would still be in office when he returned. The shuttle started to shake as it was propelled off the ground. Even though Frank could see out the window, he didn't want to. The speed of the shuttle was far greater than he wanted to experience. It wasn't long until they were passing through the atmosphere. Then, and only then, did Frank feel it was safe to open his eyes. Officer Steele was unbuckling his harness. The other officer was already floating around the shuttle. The fear Frank was feeling was turned into enthusiasm. It would be like flying, he thought. It was. Once his trembling hands found the release for his harness, he pushed off the chair gently. The same amount of force he would have used to get up from the chair, but instead of getting to his feet, he floated towards the ceiling of the shuttle. He floated around for hours, a smile plastered on his face. Steele came to him a few times to try to talk, but the happiness Frank was feeling was too strong to be interrupted by anything. He only wished his children could be here with him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he'd achieved something worthwhile. Dinner wasn't as good as it may have been in prison. Not only that, but the pilot had turned the gravity on, so he wasn't able to have the joy of eating floating orbs of food, which may have been wise of the captain. He said that if they were to just float around, everyone would start to get sick. There had been some downsides to choosing space instead of prison. Besides the food, and no longer being able to float around, not being able to see his family was going to be hard. It would make it slightly easier if he was able to talk to them, but that wasn't an option until the first 3 months were over. Then he would only be able to call them once a month. Officer Walters came into the room. The small amount of chatter halted as soon as he walked in. Steele was nice for the most part, so long as he was treated with respect. but Walters had a reputation for being a rather hard fellow to get along with. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Rads," he said to Frank. The eyes of the others went from one man to another. Frank was happy there weren't more than 6 people on the shuttle, however. All 6 people were now in the room. "What do you mean, sir?" Frank asked. "You've been convicted. You should be in a cell, not given the opportunity of a lifetime. There are much more qualified people that should be going to do this mission." "What was it you said you were?" "Oh, right, the garbage man. There isn't much use for that on the moon. Wouldn't you say so?" Frank didn't say anything. He stood and left the room. As he passed Walters, he noticed a slick smirk on his face. And the next morning, Frank was happy to see that Walters wasn't in the mess hall as he went to get his breakfast. Steele was, though. Frank sat near him and they started talking. It was good to have someone that didn't look down on him as if they were worth less than the grime on the bottom of his shoe. "Don't worry about Walters. He's just upset that he has to go back," Steele said with a wink. "It doesn't matter. I'll be free of him shortly. How long is this trip again?" Frank started eating once he finished the question. "It's 3 days, 7 hours and 15 minutes. Hey, Frank, why did you do it? You have a family, you had a life. There must have been a way to get the money that wouldn't have put you in this situation. Assault with a deadly weapon and robbing a group of people at the mall. I mean, how much did you think you would get?" Frank could swear he heard sympathy in Steele's voice. "I didn't think I had much of a choice. I was the only person who was making money in my household. The wife couldn't work, not with the baby. And even if she could, she wouldn't be able to afford a babysitter. I was only able to make enough to keep us from starving. Then I lost my job. The money was gone quicker than I thought it would have been. There wasn't much more of a motive than that. And Frank didn't think there needed to be any more of a reason than that. He did what he did because he felt he had to, and that was what he wanted to tell Steele. He just couldn't bring himself to be so rude to the man. He was the only one who had given him the time of day on this shuttle. He hoped that once he got to the moon, it would be different. Steele could see that the conversation was upsetting Frank, so he changed the subject. "This is a very special mission you're on. In the next 10 years, the government projects that there will be an atmosphere around the moon. It will make it a lot easier to work there. That's where you come in. It'll be your job to work with the scientists to make this atmosphere. You'll also be building houses for people to live in when they start coming. And they'll be coming in waves, you know. There's so much money to be had on the moon. I may even retire and go to the moon to make some good money for once." Frank believed him. There was a lot of money to be made here. Mining, construction, technologies, agricultural prospects, and more. Each of these things will be needed once people start to come to the moon. It was the escape that people needed for years. Now it was just starting to become a reality. It made him feel like a pioneer from early America, or better yet, an explorer from Spain or England. "I think I'll like it on the moon. It would be better if I could see my family, or at least talk to them when I get there, and let them know that I'm safe." Frank waited, his eyes fixed on Steele. "You know I can't do that, Frank," Steele said as he lowered his eyes to the table. "Just one phone call, please. That's all I want. I just want them to know that I'm safe, to hear their voices once more. They'll know you're safe by the checks they'll be receiving." He knew this. There was no point in trying to call. He could now see that there was no way he'd be able to get that from the guards. 10 years would be a long time away from his family. Steele was his only chance at getting an early call, and it was clear that he wouldn't disobey his orders. Even if he would, it would take longer than 2 days to get him to agree with it. It was also nice to have someone to talk to, and Frank felt that if he impinged too much, that person would clam up, so it was easier to just drop the subject. It was a good idea for him to do so because Walters came into the room shortly after. "I thought I told you that you weren't welcome to eat with us," he said once he saw Frank. "Hey, leave him alone, Roger." Steele came to his defense. Walters only stood near the door waiting for Frank to leave. He made it clear that he wouldn't sit until Frank was out of the room. Frank didn't want to cause any trouble, but he also didn't feel like he had to leave. "Come on now, get out. You have no reason to be in here." "Well, actually, I do. This is where we eat, and if you just have a look, you'll see that I'm eating." Frank gripped his fork harder than he should have. It was the only thing that was helping him control his anger at the moment. "This is where people come to eat. So what are you doing here?" A small glint of joy was in Walter's eyes. Frank had to swallow his rage, biting his cheek. He rose. Walters had a smile. He was waiting for Frank to crack, to hit him. And that would be a bad idea, and Frank knew it. First, Walters was much larger than him. Second, it would only add to the time that he would be incarcerated, and would earn him a trip back to Earth. It didn't matter what rock you were on. Assaulting an officer was a crime. He didn't slam his fists on the table, though he wanted to. He only stood, cleaned his plate, and left after bidding farewell to Steele. Walters tried to stand in his way, just one more time to push him to the breaking point. Frank wouldn't allow this man to win. He was just like the bullies that his children had to deal with at school. He would deal with him how he taught his children to handle bullies. Ignore them until they left him alone, unless they laid a finger on them. That would be a different story. He taught his children, just as his dad had taught him, don't hit first. But if someone hits you, you better make sure that they know not to do it again. But in this case, he wouldn't be able to do that. If Walters decided to hit him, he would have to attack a different way. He would have to go to the supervisors with a complaint. If that didn't work, then it would have to keep going up the line until someone would listen, even if he had to take it all the way to the press, which would love a story like that. "Excuse me," Frank said, staring at his feet. Walters didn't move out of the way. He just broadened his chest. Frank had to look up at the big man. "I said, excuse me, if you don't want me here, please get out of my way." Walters smiled. He knew that Frank was getting frustrated with him, and that was his game. Walters leaned on the doorframe. "Come on, Rogers, just get the hell out of the way," Steele said. It was only then the big man moved. Frank stayed in his room for most of the day. He needed to calm down, but no matter how hard he tried, his mind would just go back to Walters. There was no reason for him to be so nasty. He was just a power-hungry cop, a pig. Now, it made sense why the gangsters used to call cops pigs. If most of them were like Walters, it was easy to hate them. He would have stayed in his room all day if it wasn't for his stomach, which was starting to hurt from lack of nourishment. It was time to grab something to eat. There was no clock on the shuttle, and time was irrelevant in space. However, hunger wasn't. When he got to the mess hall, Walters was talking to Steele about something. Once the door opened, the chatter stopped. Walter's look of jolliness turned stone hard at seeing Frank. "Frank, we need to have a talk," Walters said to him. Steele moved over to the bench so Frank could have a seat. Whatever Walters wanted to talk to Frank about, Frank knew it wasn't going to be good. "What do you want to talk about, sir?" Frank asked. "I want to tell you about the aliens." "Come on, Roger," Steele said. He has a right to know," Walters said with a smile. Frank grabbed some food and took a seat opposite of Walters. He felt safer near Steele. "What is this about aliens?" Frank asked. Despite the feeling that it was some kind of trap, Frank was interested. He always believed that life on other planets could be real, but there was no way life could be on the moon. As far as he knew, there was no way life could sustain on a desolate rock. Well, there have been some incidents on the moon. A few people have gone missing. The first two just seemed to vanish, but the third is interesting. Fail. The third had a witness see him get taken by something with long tentacles that pulled him into a shadow. The man chased after him, but he found nothing. No body, no bones, no blood, no monster. It's nothing. Frank wasn't scared. He didn't feel much of anything, in fact. This was just another torment that Walters was subjecting him to. Besides, the man who saw that was unstable. He was known to be a little crazy before he was taken to the moon, and to have the sun shining all day and night must not have helped that. I think that the man just wandered off and got lost, or maybe the witness had killed him and hid the body. I wouldn't doubt that. That was a strange turn of events. Frank didn't know that something like that had happened. His eyes widened as Steele told him his side of the story. It made sense that the courts wouldn't tell that to a person who was deciding on whether to go to the moon or prison. They wanted people to go to the moon. It saved them from sending people who may be considered more valuable. Most likely, you just wandered off and got lost, though, Steele said. Frank wasn't sure about that. The way that Walters was telling it, the man was killed by someone or something. Walters was pushing for Frank to believe that it was something. Steele seemed like he was trying to cover something up. It was the first time that Frank felt that Steele wasn't being honest with him. Something had happened on the moon. That was true. It hadn't been told on Earth, and maybe never will be, but something did happen on that rock. The shuttle landed on the surface of the moon. It was nothing like what Frank had thought it would be. He was thinking that the houses would already be built, nice big houses that could hold a family with room to spare, but all he was able to see was 10 glass bubbles. No, some of them had green in them. A few small houses, well, small at least compared to the ones in the center of the bubble city. This bubble was huge, about 5 stories tall and the width of a football field. Inside of this bubble was a building that almost scraped the top of the bubble. That's the town hall, Steele said. Or at least that's the closest thing we have to one. That's where the research labs are. Everything that is happening on the moon is being planned and developed there. Let's go introduce you to the scientists. They're going to be in charge of you here, so it may not be a bad idea to get on their good side. Steele slapped him on the back and gave him a wide grin. Walters wasn't around them at the moment. As soon as they got off the shuttle, they headed for the big bubble, leaving everyone else behind. Frank was sure that he was able to hear what Steele was saying to him. The radios in the helmets were connected to everyone from the shuttle. This would be the last time his conversation weren't being listened to by everyone else on the moon. In the years to come, every time Frank was wearing his helmet, everyone would be able to hear what he was saying. Once they were inside the artificial atmosphere, Frank took off his helmet. Everyone inside the area was wearing clothing that they would have worn on Earth, which was another thing that Frank didn't expect. For some reason, he thought everyone would be in a silver jumpsuit. Maybe it was just because he always saw people dressed like that in the movies. "This is Steve Holland," Walter said to Frank. He was already out of his spacesuit. Steve was a skinny man with thick glasses. Fire red hair covered the sides and back of his head. The top was nothing but reflective surface. "It's nice to meet you," Steve said. "You'll find you made a much better choice by coming here than going to prison. We're a lot more, laid back here." His voice was deep and strong, but he spoke with an uncertainty that made everything he said awkward. "Thomas will show you to your housing." Thomas wasn't around when Steve said that. Frank assumed that this was another person in the room who was more interested in something under a microscope than anything else that was happening. Steve took the officers away and started to speak in a hushed voice. It didn't matter how quiet Steve was speaking. Frank was still able to hear him. There were some things that he couldn't understand, but for the most part it was clear. It wasn't until Steve leaned into the officers that Frank had become interested in what was being said. "We found something." Frank had to strain to hear Steve, but he was sure that's what the narrators had said. "What, like a new mineral or something?" Walters didn't try to lower his voice. No, this one's alive." "You must be Mr. Rads," the mousy man with the microscope said. "I'm Thomas Stone, but you can call me Tom." Please, call me Frank. It's nice to meet you, Tom." "It's nice to meet you too. I'm truly happy you decided to come here and help all of mankind. By the time your sentence is over, we should have more than enough accomplished to have people living here. It's very possible that you may even see your family here before you've completed your time with us. If that happens, you'll be given a full pardon." Frank's heart fluttered at hearing those words. Tom seemed like he would be the person to talk to about getting that phone call. All he would need to do is to get on his good side, and anything would be possible with this man. They started to walk around the bubbles. Each time they passed one, Tom would tell what it was. The agricultural bubble had plants growing inside, but they were hard to see because of the steam that formed on the side of the glass. The rest were supplies or housing, nothing too extreme. A few of the housing bubbles even had little gardens growing inside. When they had arrived at Frank's housing bubble, number 7, he was excited to see what life on the moon would be like. Excitement quickly turned to disappointment once he walked into the house. It was crude, made from the same gray rocks that littered the moon and looked as if it would fall at any moment. With all the talking about what was going to be happening here and what had already happened, he'd forgotten to ask Tom about his call. He also wanted to ask about the life they found, but it was probably better that he hadn't. Steele and Walters had walked into the bubble an hour later. "Frank, we will be coming back in a few months with rations. Is there anything we can do for you before we leave?" Steele asked. Walters just looked at the house Frank was living in. No thanks. You know, maybe it isn't such a bad idea to have you go to the moon. These living conditions aren't any better than prison, Walters said with a grin. Frank agreed with Walters for the first time on the trip. The conditions weren't great. It wasn't as if he had expected a 5-star resort, but this was far less than what he had expected. Still, it wouldn't be bad. If what Tom had said was true, they were going to be working on the housing in the next month. Then maybe he would have a better home. We brought things that will be needed for the work. If you need anything, just talk to Steve. He's in charge around here. I'll talk to your wife and let her know that you made it safely. If there's any messages she has for you, I'll pass them on to Steve. Take care of yourself, Frank. Steele shook his hand. Walters nodded. If it could even be called a nod. The millimeter movement of his head wasn't any kind of acknowledgement. More like he felt he had to do something. 3 weeks later. Walters and Steele landed without any problems. They had come back much sooner than they would have liked to. Mostly, they only go to the moon once every 3 months. Now it had been 3 weeks since they left. It wasn't even 3 weeks home. Walters was good for reminding Steele about that. The entire trip had been nothing more than him complaining about having to go back so soon. Steele didn't even disagree with him. Why couldn't they find someone else to go this time? Communication had been lost since the second week that they had been back home. It was up to them to make sure that everything was as it should be, to make sure that no one had gone crazy and started killing others. Hopefully, it was just an equipment malfunction. That being the case, they would be headed back the same day. However, they quickly found that wasn't the case. The big bubble had a huge hole broken in the side of it. The vacuum of space would have sucked all of the breathable air out within seconds. What the hell happened here? Steele asked. It's not surprising. That's what happens when you send the scum of the earth to live in an area together. Just look at the prisons and you could see that all day. The paper pushers don't understand that. They most likely never will. They're too scared to get a good look at the undesirables. They walked into the bubble. They used the door even though they could have walked through the hole without any trouble. All the equipment that had once been pristine was now in a rubbish heap. Papers were scattered across the floor, motionless and dead. It wasn't until they saw Steve lying dead they realized the problem they had walked into. His skin wasn't the normal pale, chalky color of the dead. No, it was slightly purple with a light green film on it. A darker, thick slime oozed from his mouth, nose, and ears. A new vegetation had started to grow on the desks in the side of the dome. It was the only thing that was able to grow, some kind of mushroom, green with purple circles and an opening on the top that looked somewhat like a mouth. Steele found a pencil and prodded the fungi. It let out a puff noise, and faint green mist was shot into the air, suspended in time and space. The rustling caused them to look up. Frank was sitting behind a desk on the floor. His spacesuit was on. He was hugging his knees. What happened here? Steele asked. Even Walters didn't have anything nasty to say. He was too surprised to think of anything nasty. Tell us what happened, son, Walters said. Please, get me out of here. Take me to prison. I'd much rather spend my time there than another minute here. The officer was obliged, leading him to the shuttle. They walked briskly, never aware of their surroundings. Once they were in the safety of the shuttle, they started to push Frank to tell them what had happened, but he didn't want to talk about it. Not until he was off the moon. It took 45 minutes to get back to the shuttle orbiting the moon. All three of the men didn't say a word the entire time. Walters and Steele were just thinking about what they had seen. Frank, too, was thinking about what he saw, but it was more of a nightmarish reflection than the other two. The shuttle reached their ride home, and they were taken aboard. The three men climbed out and took off their suits. The pilot changed their course for home. What happened, Frank? Walters asked in the most consoling voice he could muster. That thing they found, whatever it was, it killed them. The spores are toxic, and if it wasn't bad enough, whoever inhaled them was in some kind of trance or under a spell or something. They would act differently, never talking. They never talked if the spores got inside them. But the things they would do. Steele rubbed the man's back. It's okay, Frank. We're going home now. I think I was the first one to notice that something was wrong, but by that time, it was too late. Most everyone had already been infected. I did the only thing I could think of. I broke the dome. The thing seemed to grow faster in the atmosphere. I figured if I broke it, it would make them die, or at least stunt their growth. They didn't grow any bigger, which was good, but they still spread. They spread quickly. The people who were affected would attack others. They would become violent. Anyone or anything that got in their way would be destroyed. I broke the dome and killed one man by breaking the glass on his helmet. Frank couldn't hold it any longer. He started to bawl. Once he started, it took a long time for him to stop. When he finally got himself somewhat composed, he continued with his story. I knew that it had to be something on the moon, something that was otherworldly, but a mushroom didn't seem like something that could be so deadly. And that noise it made when it sent out the poison cloud. I heard it for 3 days after I broke the glass until it finally stopped. It just wanted to kill anything else that could still be alive. The people that got the spores in them would start to have their veins pop out. It took about 2 days for that to happen. 3 of them started turning purple. On the 4th day, they would die and have some slime or ooze from them. God, I hope I never have to hear that sound again. It's the sound of death. The officers didn't push anymore. They knew he had been through enough. With a big meal and a nice warm drink, they sent him to bed. What do you think of his story, Walters? I don't know. I saw Steve lying on the ground. He looked like Frank described. I also saw the cells they found there. It could be true. The cells looked green, but almost everything looks green under a microscope. Yeah, it does seem to be a little far-fetched, though, Steele said. All those people dead because some cells grew better in an environment that's more like Earth's than the moon's. Where would they have come from? I don't know, but you did see one for yourself. You even poked it with the pencil. The 2 men stopped talking about it and looked at one another, as if thinking the same thought. They pushed up from the table and ran towards their suits. There, hanging on the wall, was Steele's suit. A slight green film formed on the right hand. They moved closer to it, saw a small bulb had formed in the middle of the green dust. Very carefully, Steele moved the glove to get a better look. It was green. With tiny purple dots on it, he looked at Walters. He didn't say anything for a few minutes, but Walters had been thinking the same thing. We should have left these in the shuttle. We should have... Steele's thought was interrupted by a soft... I hope you enjoyed this story and the music that I composed for it. If you did, make sure to like the video and leave a comment letting me know what you'd like to see in future videos. And if you didn't, let me know what you think I can do to improve my narrations or videos. And make sure to look in the description for the author information so you can see more of their work if you'd like. With that said, have a good night.